Well, this evening it's a great pleasure to welcome Ayla Jean Yackley, who will be speaking on one of the of course most important transformations in Turkey over the last decade or more, the move from being broadly speaking neutral to a much more active foreign policy. Obviously, our speaker will fill in the gaps, but it's very, very important that we have a lecture on this topic, and I think we're all greatly indebted to her. So please, Ayla, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I feel privileged to be presenting to this esteemed group. I've prepared a slideshow so that you're not stuck just looking at my talking head the whole time. And let's see if I can now share that to get us started. There we go. Hope that looks okay. Does that look okay? Right. If that looks okay, I'll get started. Stop me if it doesn't. So last year at a lavish ceremony commemorating a millennium-old Turkish victory over Byzantine forces, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan delivered a warning to
Ayla, if I could ask you to make it full screen, please. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Just 1 second. Is this better? Is it okay now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So at this anniversary event, Erdogan warned his modern day adversaries to heed the lesson of the medieval battle or risk devastation for challenging Turkey. This coincided with Turkey's dispatch of warships to help in its hunt for hydrocarbons in waters that were internationally recognized as Greek. This is in August 2020. The maneuver thrust the two NATO members into a dangerous confrontation that unnerved both the European Union as well as the United States. In his speech, I'll quote Erdogan. He said that once again, they pursue injustice, showing they failed to learn the example from history. He thundered in his speech. We will never concede what is ours. We will do whatever is politically or militarily required, and they should avoid a mistake that will incur their ruin. They being the inheritors of the defeated forces at the Battle of Manzikert, today's modern day Greece. So Erdogan's rhetorical fervor illustrates how large history looms in Turkey's newly assertive foreign policy. His speech was made at the celebration of the anniversary of the Battle of Manzikert of 1071, when Seljuk Turks defeated an outsized Byzantine army. This set the stage for the eventual collapse of the Greek Empire and the Muslim conquest of what is now Turkey 4 centuries later. That's a very condensed history, and I'm sure historians here might object to the way that I've simplified that. But what I'm trying to get at here is that Erdogan's revival of a 949-year-old event, which was replete with actors in chainmail and archers performing feats on horseback, was not mere theatrics, but part of a latter-day, call to arms for the Turkish public. And it came at a time it came at a time in Turkey in which the government had launched several military operations. Over the course of 2020, Turkey's military challenged Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. It invaded Syria. It upended the Libyan civil war, and it staged operations in Iraq. And the most recent event was in the autumn when it supplied its close ally, Azerbaijan, with the firepower to retake territory lost to Armenia 3 decades ago. This has made Turkey a force to reckon with as it flexes its military muscle to achieve what it could not through traditional diplomacy. It is increasingly involved, as Erdogan points out, in lands that were once the domain of the Ottomans, who are the heirs, by some arguments, to Manzikert's conquering Seljuks. And here's a nice map of the Ottoman Empire, just because I like it. But this effort to recapture for Turkey the glory of the Ottoman Empire as it exists in the imagination of Turks is just one factor. And it's a minor one at that. More importantly, we can say that the United States disengagement from the Middle East under former President Trump, as well as disunity within the European Union, have stimulated both Turkey and its regional rivals to fill that vacuum and expand their influence. The reconfiguration has prompted Turkey to turn to Russia, where two strongman leaders have crafted a complex partnership despite an array of strategic divergences. And Turkey has even defied NATO to purchase an advanced Russian missile system that's designed to shoot down NATO jets. The ground now appears to be shifting. The electoral defeat of Donald Trump, a friend to Erdogan, who turned a blind eye and at times even encouraged Turkish power projection, raises the ante for unilateral action. Unlike his predecessor, now President Joe Biden may condition good relations with Turkey on an improvement in its human rights record as the new administration shifts from Trump's hands-off realism to a values-based foreign policy. The threat of sanctions from the EU and the United States, which have dimmed in recent months, but still the threat of those over Turkey's foreign exploits could exacerbate economic trouble in Turkey and constrain Erdogan's government. The country's mix of authoritarianism and adventurism has already repelled foreign investment in the $730 billion economy, and unemployment and inflation are stoking discontent with Erdogan's ruling Justice and Development Party in power since 2002. The adage that all politics are local is especially true in Turkey.
Which I could hear.
Are you having trouble hearing me? Okay. I'll keep going, but let me know if there's any problems with the level of
yes,
my voice.
it isn't very loud. I wonder if the microphone could be adjusted.
Okay.
The level seems quite low.
Okay. How's this? I just moved the microphone a bit closer. Has that helped at all? Has that made any difference?
Slightly. If you could just speak a bit more, then we could hear.
Okay. I'll speak louder.
No. That's. I think that's better. Thank you.
Okay, great. So in Turkey, foreign and domestic policies are tightly bound. Erdogan's consolidation of power at home has allowed him to shake up the region's political order, and the pursuit of nationalist interest abroad today galvanizes his conservative base in turn. But we're at a point now where Turkey's foreign and national priorities might be in conflict. Erdogan needs old partners to protect the economy, whether it's drawing investment, improving trade links, or avoiding these punitive measures that I mentioned. And he needs those to keep voters happy. And to this end, he has expressed a desire to repair relations with the West, and signaling even that he might ease up a bit at home, pledging steps toward economic and political liberalization, all since Biden's election. So I'm going to go back and do another quick and imperfect history lesson, but Turkey, for its first 7 decades as a republic, hewed its foreign policy to the inward-looking exhortation of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Secular Republic in 1923, who proclaimed that with peace at home, there's peace in the world. Erdogan, especially early on, but has continued to do so, has cajoled his nation into embracing its Ottoman past, which had been shunned by the country's Western-oriented elite, who believed the multicultural empire's expanse helped lead to its downfall. And Erdogan focused his energy during the first half of his tenure on lifting Turks out of poverty and shoring up trade and diplomatic links throughout the region. This cautious foreign policy was dubbed zero problems with neighbors. And on the slide, you see an image of the former foreign minister and prime minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu, who was credited as the architect of this effort. these days, rather than zero problems with neighbors, observers quip that Turkey has zero neighbors without problems. And the turning point, we can probably trace it back to the events of the Arab Spring in 2011. The ascendancy of Muslim Brotherhood-led governments in Tunisia and Egypt and rebel groups in Syria resonated with the AKP, which traces its roots to a banned political Islamist movement in Turkey. It shared some of the same networks and ideologies with these new governments, and this encouraged Turkey to engage more vigorously with the Middle East. Erdogan has positioned himself as a leader for the Muslim world. This has stoked bitter competition with Saudi Arabia and other Arab heavyweights. But he's championed Muslim causes. He's advocated quite vocally for Palestine. He's hosted the leaders of Hamas. He's provided refuge to Egyptian exiles escaping the clampdown on the Muslim Brotherhood there. And he's also sent Turkish forces abroad. The military is now present in at least 9 countries, spanning the Balkans to Afghanistan, Somalia, and they operate a large base in Qatar. Here's an image of some of those places where Turkey's active. And in this next slide, I'm going to play a clip. It's with Ibrahim Kalın, a senior foreign policy advisor and spokesman for Erdogan. And he articulates here how the rise of a multipolar world and Turkey's geographical destiny compels it to engage in new ways. And that sometimes does mean seeking out new friends and confronting different foes. So let's see how this playing this goes. There seems to be a problem with the sound. Or can you hear it? Did that come through at all? Could somebody tell me if you could hear that?
No, there's no sound. No.
Okay. I am a little bit, I'm not great at using this technology. So I'm going to have to sadly paraphrase because I think he puts it actually beautifully. He says in this clip, this is at an online panel earlier this year, he explains again how the rise of a multipolar world requires Turkey to, reposition and realign itself. But he insists, and this is really important and really key, that just because Turkey is engaged in other parts of the world doesn't mean that it's abandoning its Western alliance. It still remains committed to joining the European Union. Essentially, he's arguing that Turkey can be friends with an array of different countries. So sorry about that. And just one second. Okay. And it's important to note here that Turkey is still an official candidate for membership, even if negotiations have been on ice pretty much since soon after they began in 2005. Brussels has said that accession is a distant prospect and has blamed, at least in part, the Turkey's poor relations with its neighbors, as well as the erosion of fundamental rights at home. For his part, Erdogan has accused these longtime allies of taking Turkey for granted, and only after its recent show of force has it earned their deference. He often rails against the West for envying Turkish ascendancy. This message resonates with a Turkish public that is wary of foreign meddling in its domestic affairs, especially after a faction of the military attempted a coup in July of 2016. And that was accompanied with the perception that Turkey's allies in Europe, as well as in the United States, were less than robust in their condemnation of that insurrection. Erdogan has also pointed to the United States, what he calls deception, in arming and trading the People's Protection Units, or YPG, a militia that has allied with the US to flesh out the Islamic State from Syria. The Kurdish-dominated YPG is aligned with the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which has waged an armed campaign against the Turkish state since 1984 at a cost of more than 40,000 lives. Over the last decade, Erdogan's government has doubled spending on the military, NATO's second biggest standing army, to $20.4 billion. That's 3% of its GDP. It has invested heavily in a domestic defense industry with the ambition of manufacturing all of its own weapons by 2023, the centennial of the founding of the Republic. And here's an image of Erdogan with a drone. Drone technology in particular is at the forefront. Turkey is described as the most advanced new developer of drones, and the technology has truly transformed the military's capacity. And I thought that you might find this image interesting. This is Selçuk Bayraktar. He is Erdogan's son-in-law, but he's also been referred to as, and I quote, the godfather of Turkey's drone technology by a journalist friend. So, Alan Makovsky, he's a Turkey expert at the Center for American Progress, put it to me like this, and I'm quoting: Erdogan has some very practical traditional goals: achieve greater diplomatic influence, make his country a more desirable trading partner, avoid crossing red lines of more powerful states. He said, what's different now is, and I quote, Erdogan added the deployment of hard power and a willingness to project it well beyond Turkey's borders to an extent not previously seen in modern Turkish history. So this has amplified Turkey's voice, but it's also dramatically complicated its geopolitical standing. Neighbors suspect Erdogan of revanchist tendencies, and wariness has grown in Western capitals, potentially diminishing the institutional partnerships that have elevated Turkey's position so much. And the myriad of conflicts into which Turkey has thrust itself may not only overstretch its military, but it makes its foreign policy increasingly piecemeal and unpredictable. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more specific examples of these recent conflicts in which Turkey has engaged. The latest military flashpoint is in the South Caucasus, once viewed by Ankara as the preserve of Russia, which has a mutual defense treaty with Armenia. When the frozen conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an ethnically Armenian enclave that is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, when it flared anew in September 2020, Turkey jettisoned its official role as a mediator in the dispute and provided full-throttled support to Azerbaijan, which included sending some of those drones and, according to the United Nations, Syrian mercenaries to aid its close ally. Moscow brokered a truce after 6 weeks of violence, handing Azerbaijan most of the territory it lost during a first war in 1994, and also gave Turkey a role as in monitoring the ceasefire. This is an important example of how Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin are able to exploit these regional conflicts to their advantage, even when they appear to be at cross purposes. Both are driven by their mistrust of the West, and they have worked closely to sideline other countries, for example, in resolving the Syrian war, despite having conflicting objectives that have pitted the two countries against each other. And a really blunt example of this is in Syria, in the province of Idlib in February of 2020, when 34 Turkish soldiers were killed in an attack that the United States said was carried out by Russia. And this is a funeral for one of those soldiers who was killed. Russia, if I can summarize those differences, Russia is the principal backer of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and Turkey has supported opposition fighters throughout the Syrian war. And after a total of 4 incursions into Syrian territory, to fight Assad's forces, the Islamic State, and the YPG, the Turkish military has brought approximately 9,000 square kilometers of Syrian territory under its control and its proxies' control. So being on the ground has given Erdogan a seat at the table. Turkey's agreements with Russia and Iran have kept Idlib under the rebels' control, preventing the 3 million civilians sheltering there from fleeing to Turkey. Already, 4 million Syrians have made Turkey the world's biggest host of refugees. And in an effort to garner support from Europe for that last incursion into Syria in early 2020, Erdogan threatened and then delivered on the threat to open the gates, as he put it, at the Greek border and urged migrants to attempt the dangerous crossing into Europe. Russia has also profited from the cooperation in addition to the wedge that it has been able to drive into the NATO alliance with the sale of advanced weapon systems to Turkey. Russian soldiers also were able to enter northeast Syria for the first time in October 2019 after Turkey launched an operation there against the YPG and forced American soldiers to pull back. And it's important to remember here that despite sparking a great deal of outrage in Europe as well as in the US Congress, Trump effectively greenlit the Turkish incursion after pledging to withdraw his troops in phone calls with Erdogan. And here's a rendering of a Trump-Erdogan phone call. Erdogan is said to be the leader with whom Trump communicated the most by telephone. Turkey is also entangled in the web of competing interests in the Libyan civil war. In late 2019, it signed a defense pact with a UN-recognized government in Tripoli. Its entry into the conflict quickly upended an offensive by a rebel commander who was backed by Russia, France, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. In return, the government led by Fayez al-Sarraj handed Ankara lucrative energy contracts, and the two sides redrew maritime borders to foil plans by a half dozen other Mediterranean neighbors to divvy up potential natural gas stores below the Mediterranean seabed. And here's a rendering of what those new maritime borders look like that were agreed with Libya. Turkey had previously refused to negotiate a stake in these resources because of its mutual distrust with Israel, Egypt, and Syria. So that dispute is what led Turkey to send a frigate into Greek waters last August, to refer back to that speech that Erdogan had delivered. This came after years of half-hearted talks over the disputed borders had proven fruitless. Erdogan argues that applying international law on sea boundaries would imprison Turkey on its shores because Greek islands, some Greek islands are in plain view of the Turkish coast, and as my brother and I can attest, are within swimming distance of the Turkish shore. That's Castellarizo. There's an annual swimming race that we've taken part in, and this espouses this military doctrine called the Blue Homeland. And I've included an image of the figure who is credited as the author and architect of that concept. So this is this idea that defending territorial waters and securing rights at sea are just as essential as protecting Turkish soil. How am I doing on time, Craig? If at any point I'm taking too long, please let me know.
No, you can have up to another half an hour if you like.
Okay.
I'll stop you if you go past 7 o'clock.
Great. So Greece and France have demanded that the EU penalize Turkey for its actions in the Eastern Mediterranean. So far, the EU has demonstrated caution towards that. It's mindful of Turkey's threat to send migrants into Europe. And it also, I believe, understands the risks of pushing Erdogan further into Putin's embrace, and has limited sanctions thus far to Turkish companies or individual citizens. Turkey also sidestepped severe US sanctions mandated by Congress for its purchase of these Russian-made S-400 missiles. For much of his presidency, Trump shielded Turkey, accusing the Obama administration of pushing Ankara to acquire the $2.5 billion weapon system, which NATO says would spy on its new stealth fighter jet, the F-35. In the last days of his presidency, Congress forced Trump's hand by including a requirement for sanctioning Turkey in its defense spending bill. And in December, I believe it was, late December, Trump opted for what was widely seen as a light version of those potential measures, and spared Turkey's financial system. And in response, Erdogan effectively doubled down and said Turkey was in talks with Russia to purchase a second S-400 battery. I had another nice clip here. This is James Jeffrey, but I don't think we're going to get sound on this. But in this clip, Jeffrey, who is a former US ambassador to Turkey, he also led the failed effort to dissuade Turkey from attacking the YPG in 2019. He describes the significance of Turkey's purchase of Russian missiles, and he says, nothing poses a more existential threat, is the way that he describes it in the US's mind, this acquisition of advanced Russian systems. And he said that relations, which he already believed was at a 40-year low, that they could only get worse unless Turkey backed off from this deal. So. Critics say that this style of gunboat diplomacy means that it's punching below its traditional diplomatic weight. A once storied foreign ministry has been subjugated to the presidential palace, like a lot of other institutions in Turkey. And diplomats will sometimes, who are based in Ankara, will sometimes complain that they struggle to get meetings at the foreign ministry. And as relations have soured, in particular across the neighborhood, Turkey has turned to its intelligence agency to keep channels of communication open. This is particularly true with Egypt and Israel. And here we have an image of the defense minister, a former four-star general, Hulusi Akar, and the head of Turkey's national intelligence, who are with Erdogan on a trip overseas. They accompany him on most of these important diplomatic missions that Erdogan undertakes. I'm going to go back to Trump here. The Turkish president was also able to sidestep normal diplomatic channels with Trump, who described himself as a great fan of Erdogan. Their friendship initially blossomed when both men attended the opening of a Trump-branded building in Istanbul in 2012. That licensing deal reportedly netted Trump more than $1 million while he was president. And as Ankara found that it had fewer and fewer friends in Washington, dealing directly with the American president, who also valued a transactional foreign policy such as Erdogan, suited him well. According to reporting, Erdogan would regularly win concessions from Trump in those many phone calls that they had. And this worried Trump's aides, who believed he was outmaneuvered by the Turkish leader. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton asserted that Erdogan won a promise from Trump to intervene on his behalf in a U.S. court case against a Turkish state lender that's been indicted in a New York federal court for allegedly facilitating an Iranian sanctions evasion scheme dating to 2012 and 2013. But I think it's really important that despite this sort of bromance that these two leaders enjoyed, Trump's mercurial decision-making could also wreak havoc for Turkey. In a single tweet in July 2018, Trump threatened Turkey with sanctions for incarcerating the American evangelical pastor Andrew Brunson on thinly evidenced terrorism charges. And that tweet helped plunge the country's currency into a free fall. The sanctions turned out in the end to be relatively toothless, but Turkey has yet to fully recover from the economic shock that that threat incited at the time. Now we have a new president in Washington, but here's an old picture of Joe Biden. So well before he entered the White House, Biden had a longstanding relationship with both Erdogan, but also Turkey. His half-century-long political career brought him on several missions to Ankara, even as early as 1980, according to this photo from Turkish news sources. He served as a kind of point man when bilateral relations began to deteriorate during the Obama administration's later years. During his campaign, Biden criticized Erdogan's treatment of Kurds and his cooperation with Russia, and he argued that the US government should support the political opposition in Turkey. And this created quite a firestorm over in Turkey. His top diplomat, Antony Blinken, has described Turkey as a quote unquote so-called strategic partner and has not ruled out additional sanctions for its purchase of the S-400s from Russia. I also had a nice little clip here of Biden talking about how he would deal with, how he would navigate the relationship with Turkey and Erdogan if elected, but the sound doesn't work. So, for his part, Erdogan was the last leader of a NATO state to acknowledge the result of the 2020 US presidential election. And when a pro-Trump mob stormed the US Capitol building in January, Turkey issued a statement that mimicked State Department expressions of concern over political violence abroad in what was read as a swipe at the United States. Erdogan since has struggled to get the new president on the phone, a request he made back in December to speak with Biden after the election is still unanswered, going on 3 months. He has been invited to an online climate conference in April, along with, I think, about 40 other world leaders. So unless they speak before then, they'll have their first virtual face-to-face meeting in the next several weeks. At the top of Erdogan's talking points might again be this trial against Halkbank. Here's just a news image of the bank. On the right of my screen is a copy of the first page of the indictment. US federal prosecutors accuse the bank of helping Iran funnel $20 billion in an illicit oil trade. And should this trial result in a multi-billion-dollar fine, it could really hit hard the entire banking system in Turkey. And that's why this is such a crucial issue. It's something, that's why it's such a priority for Erdogan to try and resolve this politically rather than simply legally. It will come at a very difficult time for Turkey's economy. Gönül Tol, who is director of the Middle East Turkey program, said that any kind of sizable fine that's in the multi-billion dollar range would poison relationships, were the words that she used, especially coming so early in Biden's term. And then here's a little mix of different graphs and charts to show you some of the recent financial market volatility in Turkey. There's few cushions right now. There's few cushions against like a serious blow, like one that could be posed by a large fine. Economic headwinds have worsened during the coronavirus pandemic in Turkey, decimating trade and tourism early last year. in the end, Turkey's economy was one of the few to record an economic expansion. In 2020, it grew by 1.8%, but that appears to have been largely driven by a credit boom rather than a large increase in production. Despite that growth, foreign investors dumped more than $11 billion of Turkish stocks and bonds and reduced their holdings of Turkish assets in 2020 to a record low. This capital flight is very difficult for Turkey. It needs to attract hard currencies in order to pay down its very large current account deficit, which is a broad measure of trade that includes services. And with tourism on the ropes during the coronavirus pandemic, portfolio investments, people buying stocks and bonds become even much more important. But unfortunately, capital flight has accelerated this month. Excuse me. Since Erdogan fired the central bank governor, who he had installed just 4 months previously, and he named a successor who's considered far more pliant and shares some of Erdogan's views that are contrary to mainstream economic theory on the role that interest rates can play in inflation. But I don't want to go off on too large a tangent about the economy, but I just think it's important to understand that because of the problems that Turkey's economy now grapples with, it needs to attract foreign investment. And to do that, it needs to have good relations with governments in those countries where those investors are based. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to scroll down through this next section. Here's another nice picture to look at while I do that. I wanted to talk for a minute about something also that's in some ways quite a domestic issue, but in a way it shows that convergence between foreign and domestic policy quite sharply. And that is the conversion of the 6th century Hagia Sophia, or Hagia Sophia, back into a mosque. So Erdogan rebuffed pleas from Greece, Russia, and the United States last July, who urged him to keep what was once Christianity's greatest cathedral, to keep it a museum as a way of affirming Turkey's commitment to pluralism. But Erdogan delivered on a campaign promise he had made to turn Turkey's greatest monument back into a mosque. It had served for 500 years as the imperial mosque after the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul. And Erdogan called Ataturk's sort of effective deconsecration of the space, which was done as a goodwill gesture to the West in 1934. Erdogan described this as treachery. And he also said that the conversion of Hagia Sophia was a harbinger of freedom for Al-Aqsa, the Muslim holy site on contested ground in Jerusalem. And it was quite a dramatic moment when Erdogan donned a white prayer cap and recited the conquest prayer from the Quran. He's a graduate of a religious vocational school, and it was a very powerful recitation. His voice soared to the domes, that hover 55 meters above the ground. And it was a dramatic culmination of his effort to transform this once staunchly secular nation into one where religion can assume the center stage. And I'm going to skip through the next section because I do think I'm running a little bit shorter on time. There's other issues where this convergence between the foreign and the domestic occur, and that some key examples of that are Turkey's refusal to implement European Court of Human Rights decisions, ordering Turkey to free political prisoners like Osman Kavala, a prominent civil society figure, as well as Selahattin Demirtas, the 47-year-old former chairman of the People's Democratic Party, whose base is largely Kurdish. The European Court of Human Rights, has said that Turkey has violated their human rights by keeping them locked up for these extended periods. But Erdogan has accused the court of meddling in Turkey's affairs, when in fact these court rulings are supposed to be binding. Turkey's a signatory to the convention. So I'm not going to get too much into some of the other issues that stem from the crackdown that Erdogan has launched against his opponents here at home. But I think it seems as though he's feeling pressure more than ever to loosen up a bit in an effort to repair some of these ties with the European Union and Joe Biden, again, who's expected to make human rights a more important issue than at least his predecessor did. And Erdogan has in recent months promised both economic and political liberalization to do this. Among those promises have included a package of economic reforms. He unveiled a human rights action plan this month in which the government would work to bolster the rule of law in Turkey. But these announcements, these pledges for reform, have been rapidly followed by events such as an effort to outlaw the HDP, Demirtas's party, and have elicited criticism from the West. So it feels in some ways as though there's this period of, at least at the current moment, a bit of political zigzagging as Erdogan in particular tries to reach out to the West and offer an olive branch and promises of reconciliation at home in an effort to encourage, better ties. And, some of these promises might lure back some investors, especially if this new central bank governor defies expectations and is able to help reduce Turkey's chronic inflation. But it goes far deeper than that. I mean, I think that, as much as Erdogan might hope to pursue better relations with his traditional allies, the independent course that Turkey has charted over the past decade, and especially the last half decade, has bestowed upon him an opportunity to assert his ideological objectives beyond national borders. It was his consolidation of domestic power that enabled him to redesign Turkish foreign policy. And now trouble at home in the form of Turkey's economic ills might contain those ambitions, because the remedy for the country's economic ills, in order to improve that support among voters, is restoration of good ties with the West. And we're at a moment right now in Turkey where everyone's trying to figure out how long, how deeply, and if Erdogan is prepared to bear the costs and maintain the schism for much longer. So that's my presentation, and I'm hoping to turn this into more of a conversation, and I would love to try to answer your questions to the best of my ability. Thanks.
Well, Ayla, thank you very much indeed for that splendid overview that I'm sure gives us a great deal to discuss. But just before we become more generalized, could you just fill us in a little bit with relations with NATO? Because that's, of course, kind of a parallel discussion, which is nevertheless quite crucial for all this. Perhaps just a few minutes on that would be very helpful. Sure.
So the main issue that's the sort of burr under the saddle is, again, Turkey's acquisition of these S-400s. But unlike...
Ayla, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen, please?
Surely.
So we can see you fully. Thank you.
Can you see me now? Okay, so NATO has expressed the same objections to the purchase of the S-400s that we've seen from the US. However, led by Stoltenberg, there is, I think, a much more, maybe for lack of a better word, a much more diplomatic approach that maintaining and keeping Turkey within the alliance is such a critical part of the alliance's strength that there hasn't been maybe sort of the kinds of political threats that we've seen, things like the threat of sanctions from the United States. There has been trouble. I believe it was now maybe late 2019, if I'm not mistaken. I've got a little bit of the coronavirus time warp, but I believe it was late 2019 where Turkey had objected to aspects of an effort to, I think it was the mutual, I'm going to have to stop and say that I can't really quite remember the details, but there were NATO's efforts to better protect Baltic nations was something that Turkey had objected to because it wanted a revision on how it was being protected by the alliance too. So there have been these moments in recent years that have strained relations, but in the end, I think it's important to underscore what Stoltenberg has said, that Turkey is absolutely essential to the alliance.
Yes, thank you. And in the greater rapprochement with China, doesn't that seem to bear?
That's a very interesting development. Turkey was for a long time a very outspoken critic of Chinese policy towards the Uyghurs, with whom especially conservative or nationalist Turks feel a sense of kinship with, based on religion, as well as the fact that Uyghurs speak a Turkic dialect. And Turkey has become the largest host of Uyghur exiles under this latest crackdown. There are larger Uyghur populations in different countries, but such as Kazakhstan, but those are indigenous, like they've been there for much longer. And those in Turkey are ones who have arrived with the last, let's say, last 15 years. In Turkey, Erdogan went so far as to accuse China, this is at least 10, 12 years ago, of genocide, a term that's being evoked much more frequently now towards China, but at the time hadn't been. That rhetoric has diminished quite a bit. Turkey has softened that rhetoric quite a bit. And it still hosts large groups of Uyghurs. It allowed them this past week to protest the Chinese foreign minister's visit to Ankara. But at the same time, these communities are expressing concerns that their members are being forcibly repatriated to China. Turkey denies this. Turkish officials have said that's not happening. But activists say that they're being a handful, not many, but have been repatriated through third-party countries. And just to wrap this point up, Turkey, if Turkey is going to, find new friends, realign itself, grapple with this multipolar world, as Ibrahim Kalin has put it, China is part of that. And having a good relationship with China, Turkey sees that as essential. And I think the latest example is that it's China who's providing with Turkey with up to 100 million doses of a coronavirus vaccine. The other supplier is Pfizer-BioNTech, and they've contracted only for 4.5 million. So it shows you the difference. China hasn't delivered all of the virus vaccines that it's promised, but I think it's an important example of the influence that China is able to exert during the pandemic. Yeah.
And of course, there's an alternative for hard currency.
Turkish news channels like to run stories about how it's the end of the dollar and Russian, it wants to join Russia and China's campaign to come up with an alternative to the almighty dollar. So yeah, that is something that I think Turks in your average Turk might think might be to Turkey's benefit.
Well, thank you. Now we normally manage the questions, Ayla, with allowing people simply to jump in, because it's a little bit difficult to see hands up all the time. I don't want to constrain the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we try having a free discussion, and then if it gets too crowded, we can always go into a more formal way of doing it. So on that informal note, would the first person who'd like to ask a question, please just go ahead. I see Andy's first. Andy, please.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you, Ayla Jean. That was as interesting as we anticipated it would be.
Thanks, Andy.
Sort of two related questions. You basically said that all politics was local, that a lot of this foreign policy initiatives were to make up for the failing economy and to glean domestic support. Is it working? I mean, does the support for Azerbaijan, is that actually producing a more popular government, or all these, is this aggressive foreign policy actually distracting people from coronavirus and their economic woes? And by the same token, would making Biden happy by supporting human rights, conversely, would that win the government more support at home if they were let Kavala out of jail, et cetera, and just be nice to people all around?
That's a great question, and it's complicated. I think it's important to note that Turks overwhelmingly support some of these foreign forays, like the support for the public support for Turkey's aid to Azerbaijan was overwhelming. They've supported the incursions into Syria. I think there was slightly less support for Turkey's intervention in Libya, but that became more popular as Turkey was successful there. So it's important to note that these are popular initiatives. Turks feel that their large army, their historical legacy has earned them a greater say in the region. And so that really does resonate. And then your second question is about whether, conversely, would a bit of liberalization, maybe easing up, would that be popular? Was that your second question, Andy? Okay. That's more difficult to answer. I don't think your average Turk is terribly concerned about, say, the jailing of Osman Kavala. They probably don't even know who he is. He was an incredibly well-liked and he's incredibly well-liked and prominent figure in certain, circles in civil society in Turkey, but I don't know if his release from prison would be something that I don't think that your average Turk would necessarily celebrate that. There has been in Turkey, in the recent past, as recently as half a decade ago, support for negotiating with the PKK when that peace process was underway. So I would say, and now there's clearly a much more nationalist bent. Turks would, I don't know how many Turks who don't vote for the HDP will be, how unpopular banning them would be. It's hard for me to gauge that. I haven't seen any polls that show that Turks support or oppose this legal effort to shut down the party. But I think that if within 5 years you can go from a population that expressed support for the peace process by re-electing Erdogan's party in 2015, not with a clear majority, not with an outright majority, but making it the biggest party and helping the HDP cross the vote threshold for the first time in 2015 when this peace process was underway, shows you that at the very least there's flexibility in these domestic issues, that Turks can go from being quite nationalist to being a bit more liberal when popular leaders lead them in those directions. I hope that answers your question, Andy. And I think that you could maybe even put it better than I can. So.
Might I ask, I thought that was a wonderful talk. Could you say a bit about relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran? Because obviously you were mentioning Russia, but it has been Turkey, Iran, and Russia that have kind of negotiated over Syria, haven't they? Mm-hmm. But obviously Saudi Arabia, Erdogan had that trump card over the death of Khashoggi, which he sort of exploited for a bit. Mm-hmm. How do you see the future there?
So in the relationship with Saudi Arabia, as you note, it's been quite troubled, and that goes back to before Jamal Khashoggi, a columnist for the Washington Post, was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. There had been tensions for a while, and I referred to that, how Turkey's more assertive role in the region alienated some of the more traditional Arab heavyweights, and Saudi Arabia was absolutely one of those. And Erdogan, despite this clash of ideas and personalities with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and it was an incredible period after Khashoggi's death was sort of was made public here in Turkey, in which the Turkish government was leaking an incredible amount of information, including very grisly details about the murder, to the Turkish and foreign press, and really hitting out hard against the Saudi Crown Prince. Erdogan never, to my best of my recollection, named him and shamed him publicly. He always extended an olive branch to the Crown Prince's father. And in a way, while they were sort of punching below the belt, perhaps, was also trying to maintain some kind of diplomatic relationship. So that's been a source of trouble. Just in recent weeks, again, this whole shift that we're seeing since Biden's election, has also reverberated across the region. Erdogan has said that Turkey's ready to restore ties with Egypt. He has said that it's possible with to improve ties with the UAE. These are also two more rivals. He has said that the Saudis are interested in acquiring Turkish drones. We don't have any more details on that. It was just a sort of a statement that he made about a week ago. He's also actually said that he'd like better relations with Israel and even Armenia. So there has been this shift in recent weeks and months, and Saudi Arabia seems to be a part of that. And on Iran, Iran has that relationship, the way that I described the relationship with Russia could also be said in a lot of ways about Iran. It's historically a rival for Turkey. Turkey's been a good friend at times to the Iranians. It has opposed U.S. sanctions, back under Obama as well as under Trump. It opposed sanctions against Iran, but they're on opposing sides of the conflict in Syria. That's also pitted them into confrontations at times. There is Turkey's angry about the role of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, in the Kurdish region of Iraq. So it's one of those, to the best of my ability, I would say that it parallels more closely that delicate kind of dance and balance that Turkey has with Russia. The same is true for Iran. It's just that Russia looms so much larger for Turkey. It's such a vital trading partner. It supplies most of Turkey's energy resources, whether it's coal, oil, gas. Most of it comes from Russia. It's also the number one group of tourists who visit Turkey every year. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Next question, please. Well, just whilst we're waiting, whilst you think about that, of course, Greece is the fascinating factor in all this, because Greece, of course, is not only perhaps Turkey's most effective enemy, but also one for whom the Turks have the least patience. And so there's a kind of a curious balance there, almost that I remember once years ago talking with quite a senior Turkish chap, and I say, well, where does Greece come into all this? And they said, oh, Greece is about 1/10 of our worries. You know, listing all the other, they simply feel Greece can be swatted, but of course Greece is in fact an immensely effective opponent to Turkey within the European Union, immensely. You know, and of course, Russia's support for Cyprus is another obvious one, for southern Cyprus is another one. So I don't know how you see Greece fitting into all of this in the scenario that you've given us.
I think you put it really, really well. I do. I think that there is a general attitude of Greece is, again, like an annoyance, you know, and there is, I think to some extent, you know, not a huge amount of animosity towards Greece, the way that there may have been in previous decades. There's been, in recent years, quite a bit of exchange between the two countries. For instance, you know, Turks who could afford it love to go and spend their vacations on nearby Greek islands. So during this standoff last year, you would see you did see an increase a bit in the anti-Greek rhetoric in newspapers and whatnot, but it just isn't at all on the same level for the outrage that those outlets will express against the United States, against Europe, against the Saudis, Egypt, Israel. So, and I think I agree with you very much with what you point about how actually Greece is able to quite effectively sort of steer at least European policy towards Turkey. Maybe it doesn't get everything it wants. You know, I think it wanted harsh sanctions levied against Turkey for its activities in the Eastern Mediterranean last year. But in the end, what did it get? It got Turkey to pull its warships back. One way or the other, with or without sanctions. Turkey has those ships are now at Turkish docks. So that's another sign of its effectiveness.
Well, there's a question from Anthony Wynn. Good evening, Anthony. He asked us in the chat, so I'll forward it to you from him.
Okay.
Anthony says, would you please link that to Turkish policy in the Balkans?
That's a great question. And it's an area that I haven't really written too much about, mainly because there doesn't seem to be any major conflagrations there right now. You know, when I say, I made a point in my presentation that people sometimes joke about Turkey that it now has 0 neighbors without problems. That's not really entirely true. It has a very good relationship with Bulgaria, for instance. And as far as other parts of the Balkans, Turkey has really intensified its sort of soft power you know, outreach in the Balkans, in places like Kosovo and Albania, as well as in Bosnia, through schools, through language programs. Some of these schools were initially opened by the Gulenist movement, but have since been turned over to groups affiliated with the Turkish state. And so that's still an important means of projecting influence in those areas. I'm sorry that I can't say too much more about the Balkans. It's a bit of an area that I haven't written about too much, so.
No, not at all. That was very interesting. And on the Gulen list, how far is Erdogan prepared to push the Gulen question vis-a-vis the USA? You know, are they going to ramp things up more there, do you think?
It's always possible because it is a source of bitter, debate between the two countries. That seems to ebb and flow. Erdogan's calls for Erdogan's call for Gülen's extradition to Turkey will ebb and flow depending upon issues like the state of the relationship with the U.S. Are there other issues that are escalating tensions, as well as on the domestic front? You know, it's been nearly 5 years since the attempted coup, and gosh, I don't know what the latest figures are, but at one time, there more than around 500,000 people, so 500,000 people, are either in custody now or have been at some time in connection with the coup. And so in a way, the crackdown here may be extensive enough and have debilitated the Gülenist movement enough that, you know, extradition of Gülen himself, who's now what, maybe 80 years old, or at least close to it, might not be seen as so critical as it once did. That's really speculative of me. I think that officially Turkey very much still demands that he be turned over, and has provided what it says is evidence that should compel the US to turn him over. But at least this week or the last month, it hasn't really been a major topic here in Turkey.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions, please, from colleagues?
Would you say that the different branches of Islam, Sunni versus Shia, has significantly influenced his foreign policy?
He's been accused of that at times, of pursuing a somewhat sectarian foreign policy, specifically in Syria, that his animus towards Bashar al-Assad stems from that. But I think that that's difficult to sort of demonstrate all the time. For one thing, before 2011, Erdogan had this amazing rapprochement with Assad. Syria and Turkey hadn't gotten along for a very long time and nearly went to war by some accounts in the late 1990s. And, a decade later, Erdogan was hosting Assad and his wife on holidays on the Turkish Riviera. And then obviously the importance that Turkey gives to maintaining good ties with Iran is another example of the fact that, that divide in Islam doesn't necessarily prove a determining factor in his approach. That's my opinion.
Any further comments or questions?
Ayla, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having terrible trouble with I think the camera is causing it to keep crashing, and I turned the video off for the moment. But
okay.
My Turkish wife was here. She's a graduate of Ankara University. She loved fabulous lecture. Thank you so much.
That's so kind of you. Thank you.
You understand the situation, and so many people don't, including senior world leaders. And it's absolutely fabulous. I think there's one thing I didn't hear, but you may have mentioned it, that Erdogan also recently withdrew from the Convention on Women's Rights, and there's been major demonstrations, thank goodness, by women all over Turkey demonstrating what a terrible backward step this is. And that's an important factor to make. And
I think you're right.
I would like your opinion on why you think the opposition just can't seem to get through and win. I mean, I saw the pictures from Izmir, the sort of area where my wife comes from, and I think when Muharrem İnce was challenging him last time, there was something like 2.5 million people standing along the waterfront, over 6 miles of people, and they were even in boats out in the Mediterranean. I mean, he had such a terrific amount of support, and admittedly that's the homeland, Western Turkey, for the CHP. And of course the East is very different, very, very different. You've only got to go east and see. But I'm so hoping that the word will get through in that area that all is not good, and we really do need some easing up. But, you know, do you think, I think elections are coming up, is it about a couple of years?
Inshallah, yeah, 2023.
Inshallah. You are Turkish, aren't you?
I am. I'm half Turkish.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Çok şahane canım. Çok şahane.
Çok teşekkür ederim. That's
yeah,
very nice.
I'm really hoping that perhaps because he's been in power since I think 2002, and of course the Turks' political system was that they were up and down with lots of different weak leaders. Although there was a lady, Tansu Çiller, wasn't it? He'd have a lady leader for a while, although she was centre right. But it is time perhaps for a little balancing, because I think there's been too many steps back and too many breaks with the West. And it will be very interesting to see how his relationship with Biden progresses now that Trump is no longer there shielding him. Yes, he's still hiding behind Putin and several others, but financially and politically, he's not in such a good position, I don't think. But just to finish, thank you so much.
Oh,
Such
that's
an
very kind of you.
enlightened, intelligent, foresighted lecture. I've really enjoyed it. It's really been great. Apologies, I had to keep coming and going because my camera keeps crashing.
Thanks so much. That's incredibly kind of you. I appreciate it.
Inge, did you wish to comment on gender in all this?
Yeah, I didn't get too into it because it's a largely domestic issue, but it, again, actually, maybe it would have been worth mentioning because it shows again the convergence between the foreign and the domestic, and that is it's a Council of Europe treaty on preventing violence against women. It was dubbed the Istanbul Convention because it was signed in Istanbul, if I'm not mistaken, in 2011. And at the time, Erdogan depicted Turkey's role in bringing about the signing of that treaty as evidence of Turkey's leadership in gender equality. After about a year of rumors and speculation that he would pull Turkey out of the treaty, he did about 10 days ago. And that did spark several protests here, definitely in Istanbul and other parts of the country. The reason for his pulling Turkey, the withdrawal of Turkey is an interesting and complicated one. The demands that Turkey leave that convention came from some of the most hardline of his supporters. And so there's been some analysis of the decision to do that has been that feels that he needs to energize that base of his, in the event that elections could happen sooner than they're scheduled for which is 2023. And so it's sort of appealing to the base, which is a political tactic that we see in other places as well. Those hardliners said that the treaty promoted divorce and homosexuality and was immoral. And that was their argument for getting rid of it. And that Turkey can protect women against what are currently very high rates of domestic abuse. Something like nearly 1 out of 2 Turkish women suffer violence at the hand of their partner or another family member, or mental abuse. And it also has a very high rate of female murders. That Turkey can do that on its own, that it doesn't need a Western imposed sort of framework to do that. And so we're waiting to see. And another important reason why it's that convergence again between the local and the foreign is that both the European Union and Joe Biden criticized Erdogan's decision for pulling out of the treaty.
Thank you. That's obviously extremely important, extremely interesting. Go ahead, please. I heard a question. Was it from you, Gaiman?
Yes, just one quick question. Biden has been mentioned a great deal, and you were talking about President Biden Erdogan waiting for a call from Biden. I remember in 2014, when Biden was vice president, he was quoted as having said various things to students in Harvard about what Turkey was doing vis-a-vis jihadis in Syria. And there was a lot of diplomatic coming and going. There was a strong reaction from Ankara, and the White House denied it, and then it was undenied, and it went sort of back and forth. But I think it's fairly clear that Biden did say these things. And I wonder if there is any personal rancor or ill feeling there, which perhaps leads Biden not to trust Erdogan. That's one thing. And secondly, you were talking about the domestic situation. To what extent do you think the current upheavals and discussions about changing electoral systems and electoral boundaries and all the rest of it, and the reliance on the Nationalist Action Party will have an effect on the conduct of foreign policy in the coming months and years?
Both very good questions. So on the first one, yes, there was that event. You gave the date, 2014. That's right.
I think it was 2014.
Yeah, it was towards the end of, let's say, Obama's administration. That very much ruffled Turkish feathers. And I think in the end, if I'm not mistaken, Biden did apologize
Yes, he did,
for what he said. So I think that there has been a bitter taste left in Erdogan's mouth from the Obama administration, and that might color some of his views of Biden. You know, people close to Erdogan did express back last year that they would prefer a second term with Trump. But on the other hand, other than these occasional, you know, how should I put it? These occasional insults, for lack of a better word. I know that's not quite it, but at these times where Turkey and where Biden and Erdogan have disagreed, let's say, he's also a figure that I think that to some extent Erdogan is comfortable with. As I mentioned, when things were going poorly between Erdogan and Obama, when the kind of communication between them wasn't so great, it was Biden who came in to sort of try and smooth things over. So he's a figure that Erdogan knows. He may not have preferred him to be the US president right now, but I think that he's a figure that Erdogan probably feels that he understands and someone he's familiar with. So at least in the press, and the press is an important gauge in Turkey of what the government's thinking, because so many newspapers are close to the government and reflect the government view. Almost all of them do. There hasn't been, you know, a full thronged attack on Biden since he was inaugurated. So that shows you that there's probably there's Turkey's waiting in anticipation, and right now it's still probably maintaining hope that it won't be a terribly rocky start. And then your second question was about elections and whether we're seeing signs. Was your question that are we seeing signs of maybe possible early elections? Or?
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. And if you had asked me that maybe 2 weeks ago, I would have said, no, you know, why would Erdogan want to hold early elections now when there's such so much trouble on the economic front? Unemployment officially is about 13%. So economists say it could be more like 30% when you take into account the fact that the government has banned layoffs during the coronavirus pandemic. We have inflation that's running at almost 16%. And again, that is probably an underestimation. Economists say that it could be 3 times that. And so it's a difficult time to go into an election when the economy isn't doing so well. So anyway, I would have, if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said, why would that be crazy? But we have seen a series of events in recent weeks that make some people think that perhaps there is preparation to hold a snap vote. It's anybody's best guess. One rumor that I've heard is this fall, but that's purely speculative. And some of the signs that we're seeing for this include, as I mentioned, the sacking of the central bank governor, the idea there being that high interest rates have slowed lending, and you want to make loans cheap and widely available to help people out of these sort of difficult economic times. The effort to outlaw the largest sort of the party that most Kurds vote for, which is the HDP, that threatens to just upend all sorts of balances on how votes are distributed. And then I think you mentioned that there's this effort to redraw some of the districts. Mm-hmm. There's that. Basically there's a law that hasn't, I don't know what stages it is at Parliament, but it contains what some people call a Turkish form of gerrymandering to shift districts in highly populated areas where the AKP isn't doing as well, and give some of those seats in Parliament to more rural areas. And there was something else in law, I can't remember, but these are things that some people see as signs that the government is preparing for an early election. But your guess is as good as mine about why the timing would be better now than it would be in 2023. I mean, 2023 is a big year. It's you know, you can tap into that the celebration of the centennial by holding it at that year, and why truncate your term in office by holding an early vote. There's ways around Erdogan. There's ways that Erdogan can avoid a term limit. He can avoid a way of this term counting towards the term limit.
Yeah.
But at any rate, we'll see. It's as your guess is as good as mine about whether we'll have an early election or not.
Thank you. Thank you also for a very interesting and very comprehensive talk. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope I didn't get too far into details and into the weeds here, but
No, we like details. Thank you.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Well, there's a follow-up question from Anthony, which he says, with regard to Turkey's policy towards its neighbours, does Turkey not see any inward threats of subversion or infiltration coming from those neighbours? And this is not affecting foreign policy at all.
Erdogan very frequently evokes the idea of shadowy foreign forces trying to undermine Turkey from within. I listened to him yesterday after his cabinet meeting, and he referred to how they want to destroy our unity, people over, they being people over from abroad. Let me just think for a second about whether there's been any specific events recently in which I can't think of one. I mean, the trial that finished in 2018 against Andrew Brunson, he was accused of trying to subvert, Turkish unity and collaborating with the Gülenists on behalf of the United States. But I can't think of another example. Maybe somebody else, if Andrew is still online, maybe he's got a better recollection than I do.
The coup itself, of course.
The coup itself, absolutely.
The Minister of the Interior periodically accuses the United States of trying to engineer the downfall of the Turkish government. So
the Interior Minister specifically said in the hours following the 2016 coup attempt, he very candidly and openly blamed the United States for that insurrection. So yeah, that's true.
Do they believe it, or is it just rhetoric? What do you think?
I think he personally may have believed it. There was something about I listened to him that day, and it's been almost 5 years, and I still remember the tone of his voice. But it's hard to know what's in his heart. But there is a large, it's not just the government. I mean, there is a large segment of the Turkish population that at the very least finds it difficult to believe that the US had no hand in it. And the reasons for that, I think the most compelling one is the fact that Gülen is in the United States and that the United States hasn't turned him over. But there's also this longer view of the United States of it being a force that intervenes and meddles in other countries' domestic affairs. And it's, the Gülen, not only does the United States deny this, and there's been no evidence provided that would show you any kind of direct link. The Gülenist movement, by the way, also denies having a role in the coup, or Gülen himself denies having orchestrated it. So just for journalistic purposes, let's get that on the record.
Yes, and Nesrin has a question. Nesrin would like to ask you, where do you see Turkey being from the foreign policy point of view in 10 or 20 years' time?
That's a fantastic question. I wish I knew. I mean, I think that, it's so difficult to make predictions within a time frame that's longer than 6 months or a year. People smarter than me were able to predict that Turkey would become a much more powerful, muscular sort of force in the region, because investment in its military began to pick up. It's a long time project, 20 years now. There's been this move to expand the capacity of the military, and it wouldn't be that hard to imagine that wouldn't just be purely defensive, that would that was aimed at giving Turkey more clout in the region. But I, as a kind of a news person, I'm sort of focused on what happened maybe last year, maybe next week. You know, my time frame is a little bit different, so it's hard for me to predict. And I think a lot of it does depend on, you know, obviously the circumstances that Turkey has no control over. What will be the U.S. role in this region? Will NATO be able to convince Turkey to sort of recommit in spirit, you know, to to the alliance, how things take shape in regional countries? I wish I had a better answer. I just think there's just so many variables. It's hard for me to say.
Well, thank you very much. Any more questions for our speaker, please? Please feel free.
Has Turkey participated in the Belt and Road Initiative?
It has. I don't know the extent of it, but it has definitely expressed interest, and I think there were plans for the construction of some infrastructure related to it, but I'm remembering that from a few years ago, and I haven't heard anything about projects that are coming up now. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that China might be sort of dialing back a little bit on that as well, that it's such a massive amount of spending that you know, maybe it's sort of recalibrating what it expects from that project as well. So I know that Turkey was definitely talked about it. Erdogan has talked about it, has expressed interest in it, but I couldn't tell you which specific projects Turkey wants to build. The Canal Istanbul, I don't think is part of that, no, but.
But is he concerned? I mean, doesn't China have a stake in Piraeus, for instance, which is a Greek port? I mean, the Chinese Navy, that might be a factor too in them suddenly realizing he needs to cozy up to China a bit.
I think a lot, I mean, wouldn't you agree that a lot of countries are probably, you know, even the European Union almost just ratified a new trade deal, you know, with China, that there is this acknowledgement across the world that China is a good country to have good relations with, that it can bring a degree of, you know, prosperity for some countries. And if you have problems with other great powers, that it's a good country to sort of, in Turkey's case, maybe, you know, bounce them off of each other a little bit, play them against each other. So I think that I don't know too much about Turkey's sort of longer view of China. I can tell you that, as I mentioned, that in sort of the day-to-day political rhetoric, it's much softer towards China. It's much more positive than it used to be. I mean, China is the one that came through on vaccines. And, you know, if Turkey wants to strike out and chart this more independent course, part of that does mean having better relations with different countries. And, you know, who's more important than China?
More questions for our speaker. Of course, we are the Anglo-Turkish Society. I don't know whether Britain comes up at all in any of your...
I can tell you that it's one of the few countries with which Turkey has positive relations. There was a key trade deal that was signed late last year that sort of is also important for Britain in the post-Brexit era. Diplomatically, I can't remember the last time they traded an insult. Unlike Germany's, you know, Germany, France, you name it. You know, there's especially Macron, like Turkey, Erdogan is they're constantly insulting each other, Macron and Erdogan. So I think relations are it's probably the best of any European country. It's better than the relationship with the United States, that's for sure. It's a very important ally to Turkey right now. Britain is.
Thank you. Well, I think our speaker's been to work today, and she's also entertained us for an hour and a half. I'm wondering whether we ought to, as it were, let her off the hook. Perhaps if she promised to speak to us again in a future occasion.
It would be my pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time and listening to me. You know, I'm not you know, one of those experts at a think tank or something like that. This is really very much just all from my reporting. And so I'm sure that, you know, an international relations expert might have different views of this, but this is just a very sort of practical and sort of a view from the ground up, let's say.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, really, we're all very much in your debt. It's been extremely enlightening and an excellent survey. So
and if anybody, you know, in preparing for this presentation, I did create a bibliography, just to also help myself to double check. And a lot of the bibliography includes my own reporting. If for any reason anyone would like to read more about some of these topics, I'd be happy to share my the bibliography with you. So, you know, I don't know if you can get in touch through the society or to me directly. Please do.
Well, that's very, very nice of you. Thank you very much. Well, in that case, ladies and gentlemen, I think it just remains for us for a round of applause for our speaker, please.
Thank you.
And to say we look forward to the next talk, which surely is not unrelated to this one. So thank you very much, and it's good night from London, and I hope you have a pleasant evening wherever you are.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.